Oncological emergencies. Oncological emergencies, as the name implies, are acute complications that may occur in patients with cancer that require urgent treatment. Oncological emergencies may be the result of cancer itself, or it may also be a result of the treatment for cancer. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to answer these questions. What are some of the oncological emergencies? When or in what situations is each oncological emergency commonly found? How do these oncological emergencies come about? What are the manifestations of each of these oncological emergencies? And how are these oncological emergencies managed? The main reference for this lecture is Table 13.3, Selected Oncological Emergencies in your textbook. In this lecture, I'm going to discuss 6 oncological emergencies. These are onco-emergencies that are divided into 2 broad categories, namely metabolic and structural. Are these 2 categories clinically important? No, I don't think so. These 2 categories are mnemonics categories. This helps you and me remember. Actually, your book says 3 categories, but let's stick with these 2. Speaking of these categories, you have metabolic, which happens in the blood vessels. You also have structural, which means there is some physical structure or barrier that impedes or hinders natural flow or movement. Under metabolic onco-emergencies, you have SIADH, or syndrome of inappropriate secretion of antidiuretic hormone. Number 2, you have hypercalcemia of malignancy. Number 3, you have tumor lysis syndrome. Under structural onco-emergencies, you have number 4, superior vena cava syndrome. Number 5, pericardial effusion. And finally, number 6, you have pleural effusion. Metabolic oncological emergencies. So let's start with the syndrome of inappropriate secretion of antidiuretic hormone, or SIADH. However, before we really dive into SIADH, let's look at the normal functioning of ADH, otherwise known as vasopressin. ADH is produced in the hypothalamus. It is then stored and transported in the posterior pituitary gland. In response to decreased blood volume and or increased osmolarity or osmolality, the posterior pituitary gland releases ADH. ADH then acts on the kidneys, specifically the distal convoluted tubules, to do what? Conserve water, reabsorb water, bring back water into the circulation rather than excrete water as urine. In summary, in a state of hypovolemia and or hypernatremia, ADH or vasopressin will be released to conserve or reabsorb water back into the blood vessels or back into circulation. What happens then in SIADH, or syndrome of inappropriate secretion of antidiuretic hormone? Let's connect the pathophysiology with the clinical manifestations. In SIADH, more and more ADH is released into the bloodstream. How is that possible? How is it possible that more ADH is released? The answer is ADH is produced by cancer cells. The cancer cells release ADH. The medical term is ectopic production of ADH. With SIADH, think urine and think blood. More specifically, think concentrated urine and dilute blood. Because blood is diluted, hyponatremia ensues. Normally, urine concentration would be between 1.000 and 1.030. But because of excess ADH, urine becomes concentrated that is greater than 1.030. Urine concentration is greater than 1.030. Normal serum osmolarity is between 285 and 295. But to make it easier to remember, I just say 290. So in SIADH, serum osmolarity would be less than 285. So visually, as you can see in the slide, in SIADH, light yellow becomes dark yellow urine, and red blood becomes a paler red or pink. Not only is it paler pink in color, but as you can see, there is more volume. SIDH, medical management. What are some of the other clinical signs apart from dilutional hyponatremia and high urine osmolarity? There is fluid volume overload, and with fluid volume overload comes hypertension, edema, and effusions. You could also find neurological symptoms. Recall that with extreme hypo or hypernatremia, you think brain. So you will see mental status changes. You will also see decreased hematocrit because of the dilution. Recall that hematocrit is simply the percentage of red blood cells in a volume of blood. So with the same number of red blood cells in a larger volume, you should expect decreased hematocrit. What are the interventions? Knowing the pathophysiology, the interventions become more obvious, right? First, you restrict fluid to control the fluid volume overload. But you also need to correct hyponatremia. So infuse hypertonic IV infusion. An example of a hypertonic solution is 3% sodium chloride, which has an osmolarity of 1030 milliosmoles per liter. Your book says hypertonic, but isotonic or normal saline may also be used. Why? Because the correction of hyponatremia will be more gradual. and, in other words, safer. Here is what is important for you to know. With a hypertonic solution, you have to give it slowly. In other words, a slower rate. Why? That hypertonic solution will suck body fluid into the blood vessels. Therefore, the risks are intravascular fluid volume overload, pulmonary edema, and central pontine myelinolysis. What is this central pontine myelinolysis? Let me read this verbatim from the National Institutes of Health. Central pontine myelinolysis, or CPM, is a neurological disorder that most frequently occurs after too rapid correction of hyponatremia. The rapid rise in sodium concentration is accompanied by the movement of small molecules and pulls water from the brain cells. Through a mechanism that is only partly understood, the shift in water and brain molecules leads to the destruction of the myelin, a substance that surrounds and protects nerve fibers. The initial symptoms of myelinolysis, which begin to appear 2 to 3 days after hyponatremia is corrected, include a depressed level of awareness, difficulty speaking, and difficulty swallowing. Additional symptoms often arise over the next 1 to 2 weeks, including impaired thinking, weakness or paralysis in the arms and legs, stiffness, impaired sensation, and difficulty with coordination. At its most severe, myelinolysis can lead to coma, or locked-in syndrome, which is the complete paralysis of all the voluntary muscles in the body except for those that control the eyes, and death. Although many affected people improve over weeks to months, some have permanent disability. Some also develop new symptoms later, including behavioral or intellectual impairment or movement disorders like Parkinsonism or tremor. So as you grab that IV fluid from the supply room, read the label aloud to make sure what you're grabbing is the correct IV solution. Make sure that you program that IV pump with the correct rate, because with hyponatremia, correction should not exceed 0.5 milliequivalents per hour. This SIADH, or rather the central pontine myelinolysis, reminds me of the news where some college student took a dare and drank soy sauce. So this is how you might want to remember central pontine myelinolysis. Now let's move on to hypercalcemia of malignancy. Hypercalcemia of malignancy is most commonly found in cancers that have metastasized to the bone. In other words, there are two mechanisms which bring about hypercalcemia among cancer patients. The first is osteoclasts in bone cancer and or metastasis to the bones are eroding the bones and releasing calcium into systemic circulation. The second way is tumors, typically in the lungs and pancreas, are releasing parathyroid hormone or parathormone substance, which causes the release of calcium into the bones. Normal serum calcium is between 8.6 and 10.2. So with sodium, think brain. With potassium, think heart. With calcium, think muscles. Think muscles mostly slowing down in hypercalcemia. So with hypercalcemia, expect to see muscle weakness. Heart muscle slowing down, you have bradycardia. Peristalsis slowing down, you have constipation. In addition, you have somnolence, polyuria, polydipsia, and dehydration. What would the interventions be? Bisphosphonates. What is the mode of action of bisphosphonates? In normal physiology, in response to the parathyroid hormone, osteoclasts break down bones, causing the release of calcium into the bloodstream. Bisphosphonates work to decrease the action of the osteoclites. You will also hydrate the patient because hydration dilutes the calcium, dilutes the serum calcium. Dialysis is needed if hypercalcemia is life-threatening. And of course, you need to monitor calcium, phosphorus, and renal function. Now we go to tumor lysis syndrome. Tumor lysis syndrome, or TLS, is a condition that occurs when a large number of cancer cells die within a short period, releasing cellular contents into the blood. Who are at the greatest risk for tumor lysis syndrome? Tumor lysis syndrome will most commonly be found in patients with rapidly proliferating tumors such as leukemia and lymphoma, and those who have large tumors that are highly responsive to chemotherapy or radiation. It is worth repeating that tumor lysis syndrome, as the name implies, is a condition that occurs when a large number of cancer cells die within a short period, thereby releasing their contents into the blood. The easiest way to understand tumor lysis syndrome is to memorize the 3 Ps that are major components inside the cell, and these are potassium, phosphorus, and proteins. When the tumor cells are killed, the cells spill their contents, potassium, phosphorus, and proteins, into the bloodstream. The hallmarks of tumor lysis syndrome. There are 4 metabolic imbalances. The normal values, which you should know by heart, are potassium is between 3.5 and 5 milliequivalents per liter. Phosphorus is between 2.5 and 4.5 milligrams per deciliter. Calcium is between 8.6 and 10.2 milligrams per deciliter. And uric acid is between 2.5 and 8 milligrams per deciliter. The technical or the laboratory definition of the tumor lysis syndrome is having at least two of the following: hyperkalemia or potassium greater than 6, hyperphosphatemia or phosphorus greater than 4.5, hypocalcemia below 7.0, or uricemia with a lab value greater than 8.0. So again, the hallmarks of tumor lysis syndrome, there are 4 metabolic imbalances, and these are hyperkalemia, hyperphosphatemia, hypocalcemia, and hyperuricemia. So, nursing implications and interventions for tumor lysis syndrome, you of course assess for hyperkalemia, hyperphosphatemia, hyperuricemia, and hypocalcemia. You assess for renal dysfunction with a BUN with the normal levels between 7 to 20 milligrams per liter, creatinine with normal values between 0.8 and 1.2 milligrams per deciliter. You assess the urine output. A patient should be urinating at least every 6 hours. And what would be the volume? A patient should be urinating between 0.5 to 1.5 milliliters per kilogram per hour. So the intervention for TLS would be, or tumor lysis syndrome would be IV fluids and diuretics, or IV fluids with diuretics to flush out the excess electrolytes. Now we go to each of these electrolyte imbalances. By now, you've heard me say countless times, with hyperkalemia, think heart. As a nurse, you then need to monitor for dysrhythmias or EKG changes. What else is to be done? We have to get rid of the potassium, right? So the body can get rid of potassium in 3 ways: by peeing, by pooping, and bringing the potassium inside the cell. Okay, so with peeing, you give furosemide, because furosemide will help remove potassium via the urine. Kayaksalate increases fecal or stool potassium excretion through binding of potassium in the lumen of the gastrointestinal tract. And why give dextrose and insulin together? Does that even make sense, to give dextrose and insulin? Yes, it does, because insulin brings in both glucose and potassium into the cell. And insulin also prevents potassium from leaking out of the cell. And as I've stated in the previous slide, you hydrate the patient and at the same time give some diuretics. So hydration with diuresis is common for all the four metabolic imbalances in tumor lysis syndrome. What about hyperuricemia? Uric acid is greater than 8, and you think kidneys. With kidneys, you will assess with there might be flank pain, oliguria or anuria, dark urine or acidic urine. With hyperuricemia, you also think gout. So medications include allopurinol, rasburicase. You also need to alkalinize the urine with sodium bicarbonate, and again, a aggressive fluid hydration with diuresis. Hyperphosphatemia or hypocalcemia. Think muscles and GI. With the muscles, you have paresthesias, tetany. Paresthesias are tinglings and like pins and needles, feelings of tingling, pins and needles, whereas tetany would be muscle spasms or involuntary contraction of muscles. You might see Chvostek and Trousseau signs. You also have GI disturbances, which might cause abdominal pain. And you might see EKG changes too, because heart is a muscle too, involuntary muscle. Aluminum hydroxide, which is an antacid that will bind the phosphate. You can administer phosphate binders such as sevelamer. And again, hydration and diuretics. Now we move on to structural oncological emergencies. The first being superior vena cava syndrome. Superior vena cava syndrome, or SVCS, most commonly occurs in cancer patients with tumors in the chest, for example, lungs and lymphomas. The next slide will explain why superior vena cava syndrome most commonly affects cancer patients with chest tumors. The superior vena cava or superior vena cava is the major vessel that drains venous blood from the head, neck, upper extremities, and upper thorax back into the heart. Let me repeat. The superior vena cava is the major vessel that drains venous blood from the head, neck, upper extremities, and upper thorax back into the heart. And with superior vena cava syndrome, this involves tumor or tumors that compress against the superior vena cava, causing reduced return of the blood to the heart and venous congestion. So what clinical manifestations would you expect in superior vena cava syndrome? Dyspnea is the most common. Increased intracranial pressure, bringing about headache, altered mental status, and visual disturbances. You will also find edema of the upper extremities, swelling of the eyes, face, neck, arms, hands, and skin tightening. And you will also see jugular vein distension. Here you see a photo of a man with superior vena cava syndrome. The left picture is taken in the morning, where you can noticeably see that swelling is more prominent. And swelling then subsides towards the end of the day after being upright through the day or throughout the day. Superior vena cava syndrome medical management. Obviously, the strategy would be to shrink the tumor nearer at the SVC through high-dose radiation or chemotherapy, thrombolytic therapy if thrombus is present, supportive therapy with oxygen, steroids, and diuretics, and elevating the head of the bed to decrease dyspnea. Pericardial effusion. Pericardial effusion most commonly occurs in cancers to the chest, such as lungs, breast, and lymphoma. Needless to say, it is also common with cancers that have metastasized to the chest. Our heart has a pericardial sac around it. The sac normally contains about 20 milliliters of fluid to cushion the heart. In pericardial effusion, the pericardial sac fills with excess fluid and may lead to the life-threatening compression of the heart, which is called cardiac tamponade. In other words, in pericardial effusion, there is a pathological excess fluid of about 200 to 1,000 milliliters in the pericardial sac. In cardiac tamponade, the excess fluid is severe enough that it impedes the contraction of the heart. Clinical manifestations include dyspnea or respiratory distress, edema or right-sided heart failure, muffled heart sounds because that excess fluid is muffling the sound, jugular vein distension, and signs of poor perfusion. So, what is the medical management in pericardial effusion? In asymptomatic patients with small effusions, there is no treatment or conservative treatment. But in symptomatic patients, pericardiocentesis is needed to remove fluid from the pericardial sac. As a nurse, you need to assess vital signs, signs of dyspnea, poor perfusion, and signs of heart failure, such as respiratory distress, fatigue, and edema. And you may raise the head of the bed for maximum lung expansion. So this is the last, pleural effusion. Pleural effusion is most commonly found when there are tumors in the chest. Approximately 50 to 150 milliliters of fluid is normally in the pleural space to provide lubrication for lung expansion. Pleural effusion is when excess fluid is in the space and so it impedes breathing and increasing the work of breathing. Dyspnea is the most common symptom, and you will also notice diminished breath sounds, hypoxemia leading to confusion, agitation, and anxiety. And the management is thoracentesis and chest drainage. This concludes my lecture on oncological emergencies. If you have questions after the lecture, please do not hesitate to email me. Please do not use Canvas. Please use your mail, browser, or app because that's the best way you can get an immediate response from me. I normally respond within the day and less than 24 hours except on weekends. Please do not hesitate to resend your email if you do not get an immediate response from me. Thank you.